Imagine sitting in a cold, sterile doctor's office.
Yeah, we've all been there.
You're staring up at a black and white x-ray of your knee or maybe your shoulder, and you hear what has to be the most terrifying phrase in modern medicine.
Oh, the classic, your joints are bone on bone.
Yes. I mean, it is incredibly visceral, isn't it? When you hear that, you immediately picture like rough, jagged sandpaper just grinding together with every single step you take.
Right, you just assume the cushioning inside your joint is completely and irrevocably gone.
Exactly. You think chronic discomfort is just, well, your permanent reality now. But what if that x-ray is essentially lying to you?
That's the real question.
Right. What if that bone-on-bone diagnosis is actually an optical illusion hiding the real culprit?
Today, we are really unpacking the biological reality of joint discomfort in this deep dive.
It's a huge topic. It is. We're going to dismantle the idea that this is a life sentence, and we're looking at a stack of clinical research that entirely shifts the paradigm from treating structural damage to restoring internal hydration. And we'll even be analyzing modern approaches like Biodynamix joint genesis.
What's fascinating here is that the medical imaging, the standard X-ray that prompts a doctor to deliver that specific diagnosis, is fundamentally limited.
Really?
Yeah, it doesn't actually tell the whole story about what we feel in our bodies. And in many cases, it misrepresents the environment entirely.
Which is wild because an X-ray feels like the ultimate objective truth. You look at the image, you see the solid white bones, you see a tiny gap, and you assume you have the whole picture.
Right, but you don't.
So what exactly are doctors seeing that makes them jump to bone on bone?
Well, they're primarily looking at negative space. In a healthy joint, cartilage acts as the primary shock absorber between the bones. But cartilage is soft tissue, right? Which means it doesn't absorb X-rays the way dense calcium-rich bone does. It doesn't show up as solid white. It literally just looks like a dark, empty gap on the scan.
Oh, wait, so the cartilage is basically invisible on the scan.
Exactly. So when that cartilage becomes thinner over the years, or even just compressed, that dark gap simply appears smaller on the two-dimensional image.
Wait, if the cartilage is invisible on the scan, how do they know the bones are literally touching? I mean, a smaller gap doesn't inherently mean the bones are grinding like two ungreased gears.
It doesn't. And this is the crucial disconnect highlighted across multiple rheumatology studies we're looking at today. A reduced joint space on a static X-ray does not equate to active mechanical bone grinding.
That's a huge distinction.
It is. In fact, we see this incredible medical paradox all the time in clinical settings. There are countless people who have severe-looking joint stands where that dark gap looks practically non-existent, who experience absolutely zero discomfort.
Wait, really? None at all?
None. They run, they hike, they are entirely pain-free. Meanwhile, you have other people whose X-rays show only very minor architectural changes, yet they are suffering from, debilitating stiffness and daily pain.
Okay, let's unpack this, because that completely breaks the mental model we all hold. We always assume structural pain equals structural damage.
Right.
But if we follow the logic of that paradox, assuming a small gap on an X-ray means your bones are grinding, it's like looking at a photograph of a car with incredibly low ground clearance and just assuming the chassis must be violently scraping the asphalt every time it moves.
That's a great way to put it.
Right. It completely ignores the suspension system.
Yeah.
It ignores the fluid dynamics. It ignores literally everything else going on in that three-dimensional space.
Precisely. You cannot judge the ride quality of a vehicle by looking at a static photograph of its clearance. And you cannot diagnose the internal ecosystem of a joint solely by measuring the space between the bones.
Makes total sense when you put it like that.
By fixating purely on the structural mechanics, the hard bone and the static cartilage, we are entirely neglecting the broader joint environment.
So if the problem isn't always a lack of cartilage, what are the actual hidden culprits making that suspension system fail? Because nature hates a vacuum. Something has to be happening in that space.
Well, the clinical data points directly to fluid dynamics and tissue hydration. The major factors driving discomfort are actually poor joint lubrication, a localized loss of hydration, chronic low-grade inflammation, and the degradation of synovial fluid.
Wow.
Yeah. When you zoom out and look at the joint as a living ecosystem rather than a simple hinge, you realize that bone-on-bone is a massive oversimplification that causes unnecessary, paralyzing fear.
It shifts the focus entirely. If you think it's just two dry bones grinding together, you feel completely helpless. You think you need a mechanical replacement.
Exactly.
But if the issue is lubrication and fluid dynamics, that means the environment can be manipulated. So how does a joint actually stay lubricated in a healthy body?
We constantly use the car engine analogy here. If you run an engine without oil, the friction will destroy the mechanical parts, regardless of how new they are.
Right. Metal on metal.
Yeah. Inside the human joint, that oil is synovial fluid. It's a highly viscous, slippery substance contained within the joint capsule. But it doesn't just sit there like water in a balloon.
What does it do?
This fluid is rich in specific molecules, particularly hyaluronin, which gives it that thick, egg-white consistency necessary to coat the cartilage and prevent friction during movement.
So when my shoulder feels like crunchy when I rotate it, or my knees feel super tight when I crouch down, the immediate assumption I make is that I've chipped a bone or destroyed the cartilage. But the biology suggests the joint might simply be dry.
Yes. As we age, or due to certain lifestyle factors, the composition of that synovial fluid changes. The concentration of those moisture-binding molecules drops.
The oil gets thin.
The fluid thins out, yeah. And the joint loses its internal hydration. The movement starts to feel stiff, tight, and rough. And here is the vital piece of information that changes how we approach this localized dehydration. And the resulting stiffness can happen years before any major structural cartilage loss occurs.
That is fascinating. So the stiffness is the early warning system of a drying environment, not the final alarm of a destroyed joint.
It's literally the check engine light for your lubrication system.
Wow.
But because of the fundamental misunderstanding, because we culturally blame permanent structural damage instead of a dry environment, people get trapped into believing some incredibly harmful myths about how to manage their mobility.
I can imagine. Well, if the underlying issue is a dry ecosystem, that completely flips how we should be treating it. Let's look at the first major behavioral myth that stems from this misunderstanding, because I think everyone listening will recognize this instinct.
Oh, for sure.
The idea that if your joints hurt, you need to stop moving and rest them, which feels completely intuitive. If I touch a hot stove, I pull my hand away. If my knee hurts when I walk, my brain screams, stop walking immediately.
It is a totally understandable protective reflex, but it conflicts entirely with our biological reality, primarily because of a unique quirk in human anatomy. Cartilage is avascular.
Meaning it doesn't have its own blood supply.
Exactly. Most tissues in your body get their nutrients and oxygen delivered constantly by your bloodstream. Cartilage does not. It relies entirely on the synovial fluid for its nourishment and lubrication.
Oh, interesting.
So how does the fluid get into the cartilage if there's no blood pressure pumping it? Think of your cartilage not as a hard piece of plastic, but as a dense, rigid sponge.
Oh, I see where this is going.
When you take a step, the physical pressure of your body weight literally squeezes the stale, metabolic waste-filled fluid out of the cartilage sponge.
Like wringing it out.
Yep. And when you lift your foot off the ground, the release of pressure creates a vacuum that sucks fresh, nutrient-rich synovial fluid right back into the tissue.
So movement isn't just about getting from point A to point B. The mechanical act of moving is literally the heart that pumps the fluid into the joint.
Movement is the only pump the joint has. If you stop moving because you are afraid of the pain, you are turning off the pump.
Right.
You are allowing that sponge to dry out and starve, which only exacerbates the stiffness and the degradation of the tissue. Sitting still is essentially letting the engine oil settle at the bottom of the pan while the engine is still idling.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. I want to challenge this movement theory. Because if movement is a natural pump that circulates the fluid and makes us feel better, why are my joints the absolute stiffest right when I wake up?
Ah, the morning stiffness.
I mean, I've just been resting for 8 hours. My muscles feel recovered. Why do my joints feel like they belong to a Victorian tin toy before it gets oiled? Shouldn't a night of deep rest feel good?
This raises an important question about how different tissues recover. Muscles love passive rest because they have a massive blood supply constantly delivering repair nutrients while you sleep. Joints operate on a totally different rulebook.
Okay.
You feel stiff in the morning precisely because sleep is prolonged inactivity. For 6 to 8 hours, you are relatively motionless. The physical pump is turned off.
So the sponge isn't being squeezed.
Right. Without that mechanical pressure cycling on and off, the synovial fluid isn't actively circulating into the cartilage. It thickens slightly, and the tissues become temporarily dehydrated.
Ah, that makes sense.
But as you've likely noticed, once you actually get out of bed and walk around the kitchen for 10 minutes, that fluid starts circulating again, the sponge absorbs the hydration, and the joints start to feel looser and smoother. Morning stiffness is the ultimate proof that your joints require mechanical movement to maintain their lubrication.
Okay, so if movement is the ultimate solution, how did we arrive at this cultural assumption that once you hit 60, you're just destined to sit in a recliner with a heating pad? This is another myth that the research aggressively attacks, isn't it? The idea that physical decline and daily joint pain are just the entry fee for getting older.
We constantly conflate chronological aging with environmental neglect. Yes, cellular metabolism slows down as we age, but chronic debilitating discomfort is not a biological imperative.
Right.
If you look at active populations around the world, there are millions of adults in their 70s and 80s who are hiking, gardening, and exercising entirely pain-free. The difference isn't some mutant gene.
They aren't magically exempt from human anatomy.
No, the difference comes down to the internal environment they've maintained. Things like systemic hydration, managing inflammatory loads through nutrition, preserving muscle mass, and maintaining that fluid circulation through daily habits. We often blame aging for what is actually just decades of underlubrication and undermovement compounding over time.
Which brings up a very practical fear a lot of people have when they do try to move more. What about the noises?
Oh, the popping.
Yes. I can't even sneak downstairs for a midnight snack without my ankles sounding like snapping twigs. The cracking, popping sounds feel terrifying because, again, we associate noise with structural damage. What is actually happening biologically when a knee pops?
Joint cavitation, which is the medical term for those popping sounds, is surprisingly common and, in the vast majority of cases, entirely harmless.
Okay, phew.
The synovial fluid inside the joint contains dissolved gases, mostly nitrogen. When you move in a way that suddenly changes the pressure inside the joint capsule, those dissolved gases can rapidly form bubbles and pop.
Wait, so my ankle isn't splintering, it's just experiencing a sudden shift in atmospheric pressure. It's essentially burping nitrogen.
That is a very accurate, if slightly unglamorous way to visualize it, yes. Alternatively, the sounds can simply be tendons or ligaments shifting slightly over a bony prominence as you move.
Like a rubber band.
Yeah, exactly. A tight tendon snapping back into its groove can sound surprisingly loud. But the noise itself is rarely a diagnostic criteria for damage.
When should someone actually worry about the noise then?
It only becomes clinically relevant if the cracking sound is accompanied by acute pain, persistent swelling, a feeling of instability like the joint is literally giving way, or a sudden locking of the joint. If it just sounds loud but functions perfectly and painlessly, it's generally just fluid dynamics and shifting connective tissues doing their job.
Okay, realizing that joints are these dynamic, complex systems relying entirely on fluid pressure, gas exchanges, and rigid sponges, rather than just static pieces of cartilage, naturally leads to the modern scientific shift in how we try to support them. We aren't just trying to mask pain with over-the-counter tills anymore.
No, we are seeing a fundamental change in philosophy in rheumatology and sports medicine right now. The focus is shifting heavily towards cellular hydration. A healthy joint relies on these water-rich tissues, particularly the synovial membrane, to produce that thick, shock-absorbing fluid. The modern goal isn't to block the pain signal to the brain, it's to actually rehydrate the ecosystem.
And this is where our deep dive materials introduce specific, targeted solutions designed around this paradigm shift, specifically highlighting formulations like Biodynamix joint genesis.
Yes, exactly.
But I want to look at this objectively because it's easy to throw around terms like internal hydration. How does a supplement taken orally actually reach the isolated vascular ecosystem of a knee joint? It's not like you're injecting motor oil directly into the knee.
That is the critical question regarding systemic supplementation. You aren't injecting fluid directly. Instead, formulations like Biodynamix are designed to provide the specific biochemical precursors that the body uses to synthesize its own synovial fluid.
Okay, what does that mean in plain English? What are the building blocks?
One of the primary targets is a molecule called hyaluronin, which we mentioned earlier. Hyaluronin acts like a biological magnet for water. It can hold up to 1,000 times its weight in water, which is what gives joint fluid its thick, lubricating quality. As we age, our natural production of hyaluronin drops off steeply.
So the oil gets thin.
Exactly. The premise of an approach like Biodynamix joint genesis is to introduce specific, highly absorbable compounds into the digestive tract. These compounds are absorbed into the bloodstream where they circulate systemically.
And then?
Well, once they reach the synovial membrane, which is the tissue surrounding the joint that does have a blood supply, the membrane extracts those building blocks and uses them to naturally ramp up the production of high-quality, hyaluron-enriched synovial fluid.
So it's not a painkiller. It's literally trying to give the synovial membrane the raw materials it needs to manufacture better oil, which then gets squeezed into the cartilage sponge through movement.
That is the intended mechanism of action. By supporting the internal chemistry that creates the lubrication, you are addressing the root cause of the friction.
That's a huge shift.
It's a proactive biological approach rather than a reactive analgesic one. The goal is to make the joint feel smoother and easier to move from within by restoring the fluid environment that the cartilage requires to survive.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener, right now? We've talked about the internal chemistry and how supplementation targets the raw materials. But the research is also very clear that you cannot just take a capsule and then sit on the couch for 10 hours a day.
Definitely not.
You have to manipulate your external environment, your daily habits, to maximize this biological process.
Internal supplementation works best when it is paired with mechanical action. The clinical data provides a very straightforward roadmap for this. First and foremost is maintaining consistent, low-impact activity.
So we're talking about keeping the sponge pumping without slamming it with excessive force. Things like walking, swimming, cycling, yoga.
Correct. You want the fluid circulation without the heavy repetitive trauma. The second critical habit is maintaining muscle strength around the joints.
This is one I think people overlook when they are in pain. Why does muscle strength matter if the joint is the problem?
Because muscles act as active shock absorbers. Every time your foot hits the ground, a massive amount of kinetic force travels up your leg.
Right.
If your quadriceps and hamstrings are strong, they absorb and dissipate a large percentage of that force. If those muscles are weak or atrophied, the force bypasses the muscle and goes directly into the structural joint, overloading the cartilage. Even light resistance training builds a support network that takes the stress off the internal joint mechanics.
You don't have to become a competitive power lifter. You just need enough muscle tone to act as a scaffolding for the joint. What else is on the roadmap?
Systemic hydration. It sounds almost too simple to mention, but you cannot synthesize water-rich synovial fluid if the body is chronically dehydrated. Drinking adequate water provides the baseline systemic hydration required for the synovial membrane to do its job.
It's the most basic raw material. And the final point in the research is probably the hardest one for anyone working a modern desk job, which is breaking up prolonged periods of sitting.
We established that inactivity turns off the fluid pump. Sitting at a desk for 4 hours straight allows the synovial fluid to settle and thicken.
The oil pooling at the bottom.
Exactly. Simply standing up, doing a few deep knee bends, or walking to the kitchen every hour reactivates the pump, rehydrates the cartilage sponge, and prevents that severe afternoon stiffness from setting in.
I find this entirely empowering. It completely dismantles the terror of the bone-on-bone diagnosis. It proves you don't need to completely upend your life, and you certainly don't need to just accept physical decline.
Not at all.
Gentle, consistent care, drinking water, doing light resistance work, walking, taking standing breaks, and potentially providing the right internal raw materials through a targeted approach like Biodynamix is what keeps the entire system functioning smoothly.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the major takeaway is that a two-dimensional X-ray is not your destiny. Your joints are not just inert mechanical gears that inevitably grind down until they must be surgically replaced.
They're living ecosystems.
They are highly dynamic living ecosystems. And like any biological ecosystem, they respond beautifully when you provide them with the proper hydration, the right nutritional building blocks, and the mechanical movement they require to thrive.
And that is the exact shift in perspective we wanted to deliver to you today. If you've been struggling with stiffness, or if someone in a white coat has told you your joints are just worn out, the first step toward reclaiming your mobility is throwing out that broken mechanical model. Stop picturing sandpaper. Start picturing a sponge that just needs to be squeezed.
The science of human mobility has moved far beyond just looking at the bones. It is entirely about nurturing the fluid environment that surrounds them.
Which leaves us with a truly fascinating and somewhat provocative idea to consider as we wrap up. If our joints, these structures we always assumed were just hard, brittle, deteriorating parts, are actually this incredibly dynamic, responding so dramatically to simple internal hydration and gentle mechanical pumping, it makes you wonder, How much of what we blindly accept as the inevitable physical decline of aging in the rest of our bodies is actually just a sign that our internal systems have simply dried out and we've just forgotten how to keep the pump running?